A lot of people, in particular NGOs, deliberately make migrants into refugees. It is not the case that people coming into Europe in recent years are refugees, not the majority.
They are not refugees?
No, they're migrants. Most people, even the EU's Frontex border agency admits now that of the people who came in 2015, at least 60%, 60%, had no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the rest of the world. These are people fleeing often, always, bad economic situations. I don't deny that at all. But that is different from being a refugee. And I am amazed at the way in which NGOs and some government officials and many politicians deliberately pretend that migrants and refugees are the same thing.
Why are they doing it? Why they change the language, the terms, so to speak?
Well, one is that they're not politically capable of sustaining the difference between the law and illegality. I mean, let me give you the other one that happens. As well as migrant, refugee, we have legal and illegal, as if there is very little difference between them. The difference is everything, it's the law. But a lot of people have decided they don't bother about that. Everyone's a migrant. They don't care to spend... Look, it's difficult apart from anything else, isn't it? If you consider every single case of every single person coming into Europe, that takes a lot of time. A lot easier just to say, let them come, they're all migrants, they're all refugees. Who are we to keep them out? This is the argument, this is the attitude of a massive proportion of the European political elite. They don't have the strength to do the basic thing of holding on to the concept of the law.
What about the human aspect of this problem, of refugees, of migrants?
Well, I've gone to many of the countries that people flee from, but I decided in 2015 and 16 to go to the places in Europe that they were arriving into, the refugee camps of southern Europe, the Italian islands, the Greek islands. And so I saw this face-to-face many times, and I write about it in the book, because if you're going to deal with a very difficult question, you have to stare it in the face. The reality is that there are people fleeing war, like the Syrian civil war. I think there's a very significant debate to be had about whether the best thing to do with Syrian refugees is to put them in Scandinavia, but let's park that for the time being. Is it the case that everybody else fleeing is analogous to Syrian refugees? No. And in the long term, what are the consequences of taking such a lax and lazy view? There was a poll last year carried out by, I think, Ipsos Mori in sub-Saharan Africa. 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africa wants to move. 1/3. So, if we fail at this now, and we are failing at it now, what are we going to do in the decades ahead?
I assume that if this reality will continue in the future, it will change the culture of Europe.
Well, that's already changed. I think that a certain amount of migration can be good for a country. I'm not against all movement of people. But to so fundamentally transform a society seems to me at the very least unwise if you don't know where you're going with it. And we had no idea where we were going with it. And so, as I say, this is something that's been going on now for 70 years.
Can you give us some examples of the changes which are occurred in Europe, cultural changes or maybe religious changes in Europe?
Let me give you an example. The official statistics from the UK, the 2011 census, this is the official government census, found every religion in Britain was falling off exponentially. Christianity, of course, spiraling down, people who identified as Christian. The number of people in the UK identified as Muslim doubled in that decade, and it's predicted to double in the decade that we're in. So that's a very significant change. It's a very significant change. Let me give you one other from that census, the official census in the UK. People who identified as white British, that's the words of the census, not mine. People who identified as white British were a minority in 23 out of 33 London boroughs. So they were a minority in London. All societies in Western Europe, Eastern Europe is different for all sorts of reasons, but all societies in Western Europe are trying to cope with the fact that the world has come into us. And our answer to this is to come up with a self-definition which is alarmingly shallow, but very, very wide, because we're trying to encompass the world. And let me give you an example of that. In my grandparents' generation in the UK, if you said, what is it to be British? It wasn't a hard question to answer. It's a set of institutions which mirror the public back to the institutions. So you have the monarchy, parliament, the law, the church, the great schools and the great universities. These were the army forces, the public schools, all sorts of things. You knew what Britain was. If you say now, what is it to be British? It's like putting somebody on a psychiatrist's couch and giving them a nervous breakdown. People say things like, this is what our politicians say, they say things like, Britishness is about being nice. Well, everybody thinks they're nice. I'm sure the mullahs in Tehran think they're nice. I bet the Saudis think they're nice. It's an incredibly bland and vague aspiration for national culture. But we do that because we're trying to keep everyone on board, because what are the options otherwise?
I assume, Mr. Murray, that you support the policy of President Trump. Maybe
Which one?
Good question. You support maybe the approach of the Israeli government. Both these bodies build walls along the international borders. Do you support this solution?
Well, I think walls are a perfectly reasonable answer if you've got a migration problem, yes. We live in an era of very odd sloganeering. One of the slogans I hear most is people who say, build bridges, not walls. They should come to my home city of London, where all of our bridges are now covered in walls. They're covered in walls because 2 years ago now, twice, people who should not have been in Britain decided to drive cars into the general public on our bridges, Westminster Bridge and then London Bridge. So I like to say it's not an either-or with walls and bridges, is it? If you are unwise about your borders, if you're lax about your borders, you will have all sorts of problems internally. So I don't regard walls as being these wicked, terrible, unnatural things that they're now presented as. They've done a lot of good historically. Have they done harm sometimes? Yes. But everything's done harm sometimes.
I think that some people, some intellectuals, if I'm not mistaken, will blame you for racist approach.
Sure. Whenever you vote for the wrong party in Europe, you're called a racist.
Which party is the wrong party?
The ones that aren't far left and in favor of open borders. They're always the wrong parties. I think it's a term that has been losing its effect. And by the way, I think that's a very dangerous thing long term. It's like misusing fascist or Nazi as terms. You might need these terms, we might need these terms down the road. So it's very, very unwise to use them on everyone. Because if you use them on everyone, then you'll end up being able to use them on no one. But I deeply resent the people who claim that because I'm in favor of a reasonable immigration and asylum policy, that makes me Adolf Hitler. You know, I think it's not the case.
No, I don't think so.
But I'm struck, you know, because all across Europe, this very dangerous game has been played. They've tried to ruin so many people's careers and lives, and they have. And I know that everything I say in my book is agreed on by the majority of the public in every European country.